Annie had barely put down her paintbrush when the phone rang. Nathan's voice was as icy and aloof as the many times they had slept in the same bed. Silence. "I'll be late. Don't wait up," Annie said. Short, curt, and emotionless. Annie sat motionless, clutching the brush firmly in her hand, staring at the partially completed painting in front of her. The picture showed a brightly lit room full of laughter, and the warm colors she had painted felt like a cruel parody of her own life in this house. Too large, too immaculate, too quiet, like a forgotten extra in someone else's story waiting for the page to turn. Annie blinked, her heart thumping a little as she walked down the hallway, her hand shaking a little as she reached for the doorknob. When she opened it, it wasn't Nathan. Despite her short-sighted hope that he might surprise her with flowers or an apology. Instead, it was Elias Nathan, Nathan's half-brother. Elias was there with a tool bag casually slung over his shoulder and raindrops sticking to his leather jacket. He grinned a half-smile that seemed so natural yet had the odd ability to make Annie temporarily speechless. "Annie," he murmured in a warm voice, "I hope I'm not bothering you." "Elias. What? Why are you here at this hour?" "You probably wouldn't need," she responded, attempting to maintain her composure despite her heart's already rapid pace. "Nathan asked me to drop by and fix a few things around the house," Elias remarked, entering the doorway with a lingering smile and a knowing gleam in his dark eyes. "The help, but I think he underestimated just how wrong he could be." Annie chuckled softly, her laugh escaping before she could stop it from coming in. She said, stepping aside to let him in. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, she felt it. Something had shifted. The air in the house grew heavier, charged with an unfamiliar tension, as though Elias had brought a quiet storm with him for the first time in months. The oppressive emptiness she had grown used to seem to lift, replaced by something she couldn't yet name. Set his tool bag down by the wall, his eyes sweeping the house with an almost curious intensity. "This place," he mused aloud, "is so much like Nathan, perfectly polished, but suffocating." Annie let out a laugh, short, sharp, unintentionally. "He likes everything neat and orderly. And you?" Elias turned to her, his gaze direct and unrelenting under the soft glow of the hallway light. "Do you like living in all this order?" The question caught her off guard. Annie hesitated, turning away to escape the weight of his gaze. She walked toward the kitchen, pretending to search for something in the fridge. But his words clung to her like shadows. His question was simple yet terrifying in its implications. "Are you happy?" And she hated the truth that simmered beneath her silence. She didn't know. As she fumbled with a bottle of water, she heard his footsteps behind her. Annie turned slowly to face him, and for the first time she noticed something in his eyes that she had never noticed before. It wasn't playful or teasing. It was raw and unfiltered intensity. In that moment, Annie forgot Nathan. She forgot the endless silences, the hollow words, and the routines that had drained her of every spark of joy. All she could see and feel was Elias standing inches away from her, his presence filling the kitchen like a freshly ignited fire. He was close, too close. She could feel the warmth of his presence in stark contrast to the cold of the house. At that moment, Annie realized that the storm Elias had brought with him was not only upsetting her, but also upsetting her heart. The kitchen was bathed in a gentle golden light, but Annie felt as though she was standing in total darkness. Elias's words kept repeating in her head. "Do you like this life?" She hadn't answered because she didn't want to, but rather because she wasn't sure she even knew the answer. Her life with Nathan was like a painstakingly framed, polished, and completely empty painting. Annie's thoughts drifted back to the early days of their marriage, when Nathan was a man of passion who could spend entire evenings in her studio applauding her kiss and her paint-stained hands, telling her they were the brushes that painted entire worlds. But as time passed, the words of admiration gave way to work calls, forgotten promises, and eventually long, heart-wrenching silences she couldn't pinpoint when it had begun. But at some point Annie started to feel like just another piece of furniture in her own home. Nathan loved order, loved the grandeur he could display to friends, and she suspected that to him she was merely another piece in his collection. He no longer looked at her as the woman he once adored. Instead, his gaze was perpetually drawn to his phone, his contracts, his projects Annie had tried to hold on. There was a night not long ago when she set up a romantic dinner by candlelight wearing the dress Nathan had once told her was his favorite. But when he came home, all he did was loosen his tie, open his laptop, and mutter a single sentence, "I'm too tired tonight. Let's do this another time." That night she sat alone at the beautifully set table, tears falling silently onto plates of cold, untouched food. With Elias was different from the moment he entered the house. He looked at her as though she truly existed, as though she mattered. Elias didn't talk much, but every word he said had a way of cutting through her, of stripping away her defenses. It was as if he could see all the things she tried to bury, even from herself. At times it scared her. But there were moments when she craved that kind of truth, even if it hurt. "Did you love painting as much as this once?" Elias asked one afternoon as they tidied her studio together. He held up one of her unfinished works, studying the bold but incomplete strokes with an intensity that made her chest tighten. Annie didn't respond immediately. She stood there, remembering what it was like to really immerse herself in her painting, her hands shaking. "I used to believe that painting was everything. But now that Elias has gently put the painting down and moved closer, I'm not sure I can feel anything at all." "Why did you stop?" Annie's eyes were clouded with sadness as he asked, his gaze locking onto hers and probing deeper than she felt comfortable with. "Nathan doesn't need it. He needs a perfect wife, not an artist with paint-smeared hands." Her response caused Elias to laugh softly, but the sound was tinged with bitterness. "So you gave up who you are to become what he wanted. Is it worth it?" "Annie." She didn't respond, but deep inside she knew that question wasn't just for Elias. It was one she needed to answer for herself. That night, the rain came unexpectedly, tapping against the glass panes and streaking down like silent tears. Annie stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze lost in the haze veil of falling rain. Nathan had been gone for 2 days, and the house felt colder, emptier with each passing hour. But tonight was different. Elias was here, and his presence filled the space with an unfamiliar energy she couldn't quite name. In the kitchen, Elias was busying himself with something. Annie wasn't sure what he was doing, but the soft clinking of objects and faint movements carried through the house, breaking the suffocating silence she had grown used to. A moment later, he appeared in the doorway of the living room holding 2 steaming mugs of hot cocoa. "You need this," he said, a mischievous twinkle in his eyes. Annie smiled, taking the warm mug from his hands. "You always know how to lighten the mood," she said, her voice softly. Elia sat down beside her, closer than was necessary. The warmth of his body seemed to radiate through the air between them. "Are you always this tense?" She let out a little laugh before she could stop it when he questioned in a tone that was a combination of light-hearted taunting and sincere interest. Elias tilted his head and studied her. "I don't think I'm tense. Maybe I've forgotten how to relax. It isn't hard," he said. "But you just have to want to try." Annie opened her mouth to reply, but a lightning strike lit up the room, followed by a thunderclap that rattled the windows. And the rain got worse, hammering against the glass as if it might shatter it. With his eyes shining with a challenge, Elias stood up and arched an eyebrow. "Have you ever gone walking in the rain?" he questioned. "Are you serious?" Annie shook her head as it poured outside, but before she could respond, Elias grabbed her hand and dragged her to her feet. "Some things in life you just have to do once, Annie." Before she could object, he was leading her out the front door, both of them running straight into the freezing rain. Annie laughed, really laughed, the sound blending with the rhythmic patter of the rain. It felt strangely liberating, as if the storm had swept away the invisible chains she had been carrying for years. Elias led her to the backyard, where the slippery stone steps glistened under the dim glow of the porch light. They stood there drenched to the bone. But for the first time in what seemed like forever, Annie didn't care. There was no mask to wear, no restraint, just her, the rain, and the unbridled sense of freedom that accompanied it. Elias stepped closer, his dark eyes locking onto hers with such intensity that her chest tightened. "Are you aware of your appearance?" he said. "When you laugh," in a low, almost reverent voice, and Annie froze, her smile slowly disappearing from her lips as she whispered. her voice trembling slightly like someone who had just found herself again. He took another step forward, so close that she could feel his breath mingling with the cold rain. "Have you ever wondered if you would live differently if you allowed yourself to?" he asked, the question lingering in the air, cutting through the rain and lodging in her heart. Annie opened her mouth to respond, but she didn't, and then, as if everything had been building to this point, Elias slowly raised his hand and brushed his fingertips against her cheek. His touch was hesitant, as though he was waiting for her to pull away, but she didn't. Elias leaned in, his lips barely brushing hers, a whisper of a kiss, but that gentle, tentative touch was enough to send warmth, causing Annie to chase away the chill of the storm. Annie closed her eyes, giving herself over to him as all the fears and restraints she had clung to melted away in the rain when they pulled Annie's breath apart in uneven gasps. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, Annie felt every ounce of logic and control she had worked so hard to maintain slipping away, her heart pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. Elias looked at her, his eyes filled with both longing and uncertainty, as if he too understood the enormity of what had just happened. "If you want me to stop, I will," he murmured, his voice, horror and roar. But Annie didn't answer. She stood there letting the rain soak through her clothes and into her skin as the feelings she had tried so desperately to deny rose to the surface, undeniable and unrelenting. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting pale rays across Annie's face. But it did little to clear the chaos storming in her mind. She sat upright in bed, clutching the blanket tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping her from slipping into the emptiness she felt threatening to engulf her. The memory of last night lingered like a searing mark on her lips. The kiss with Elias wasn't just a fleeting moment of weakness. It was an awakening, a spark reigniting something she had buried deep within herself for years, but now in the stark clarity of daylight. The weight of it all pressed down on her with crushing force. Last night hadn't just been an impulsive mistake. It was a boundary crossed, a line obliterated. Elias had left early that morning, but not without leaving a note on the kitchen counter. The words were brief but heavy. Last night was real. Annie knew she had to make a decision, but she hadn't anticipated it coming so quickly. By noon, she was still lost in her own thoughts when the sound of the front door opening startled her to her feet. Nathan was home, and he entered with his typical air of fatigue. But this time, something was different about him. His probing, sharp gaze lingered on her for a little too long, and Annie tried her best to remain calm, but his presence felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around her. Nathan said, "Are you okay?" in a quiet but suspicious tone. The atmosphere was thick with unsaid tension that evening when they all sat down for dinner. Annie, Nathan, and Elias. Elias tried to keep a casual demeanor, but his glances toward Annie were quick and telling. Nathan, who remained silent, seemed to sense the undercurrent in the room, and the air between them was taut like a wire stretched too far, ready to snap. Nathan put down his knife abruptly, his gaze piercing as he turned to Elias. "You've been staying here for quite a while now, haven't you?" Elias grinned and his jaw tightened as if he were about to reply, but Annie interrupted before things got out of hand. "Nathan, don't cause a problem," he remarked in a calm but abrupt tone. "It seems you're getting a bit too comfortable in this house. Elias hasn't been a burden at all, but when I asked him to remain and help with a few household chores." Nathan's eyes sprang toward her like a blade. "Is that correct, Annie? Or am I missing something?" His words caught like a hammer, breaking the delicate silence in the room. Annie's chest constricted, and she briefly felt as though she was unable to breathe, realizing how vulnerable her position had become. One mistake, one poorly chosen word, and everything would fall apart. "What are you discussing, Nathan?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady though it trembled at the edges. Nathan didn't answer immediately, he simply stared at her, his gaze heavy with suspicion and something else she couldn't quite place. After a long, excruciating pause, he stood and left the room without another word, leaving the weight of his presence behind like an open wound. The silence that followed was deafening. Elias remained seated, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though anchoring himself. Finally, he broke the stillness. Are you going to tell him? He asked, his voice rough but steady, laced with urgently. Annie turned to him, her eyes red and glistening. And what should I say, Elias? That I betrayed him. That I allowed myself to feel something I shouldn't have. It's not about what you shouldn't feel, Elias interrupted, his gaze unwavering. It's about what you deserve to feel. It's about being brave enough to live the life you want. His words struck her like a blow, raw and unrelenting. Annie didn't respond. She rose from the table and walked out of the room, leaving Elias behind, his eyes following her retreating figure until she disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. That night, as Annie lay in bed, tears streamed silently down her face, soaking the pillow beneath her. She was standing at a crossroads, and no matter which path she chose, there would be no going back. On one side was a marriage steeped in responsibility but devoid of warmth. On the other, a blazing, unpredictable connection with Elias. But Annie knew deep down that either choice would demand sacrifices she wasn't sure she was ready to make. Annie couldn't sleep. The night stretched on, dark and endless, her mind a labyrinth of tangled thoughts with no clear way out. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks in the window like a ghostly reminder that time was slipping by. Indifferent to her turmoil, in the oppressive silence of the night, she could hear every frantic beat of her heart, wild and erratic, as though it was trying to tear itself free from her chest, unable to bear the suffocating weight of the bedroom any longer. Annie rose from the bed. The darkness enveloped her as she stepped into the hallway, the quiet of the house no longer comforting but eerie, hollow. Each step across the cold wooden floor felt like she was drawing closer to a decision she wasn't sure she was ready to make. The door to the living room was ajar, and a faint glow from the table lamp spilled out into the hallway inside. Elias sat hunched forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes lost in thought. He didn't look up as she entered, but her presence was enough to shift the air in the room. Annie hesitated by the door, unsure of how to start. Finally, it was Elias who broke the silence. "Have you made up your mind yet?" he asked softly, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet tremor. Annie didn't respond immediately. She walked close, her gaze fixed on the flickering light of the lamp, its unsteady glow mirroring the chaos in her mind. "I don't know, Elias," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything feels so overwhelming. I don't know if I have the courage to change." Elias rose from his seat and took a step closer. He reached out his hand, brushing lightly against hers, a touch so fleeting that Annie couldn't tell if it was meant to comfort her or plead with her. "I'll be here," he said, his voice resolute, his eyes holding a sincerity that pierced through her walls. "No matter what you choose. But Annie, you need to start living for yourself, not for anyone else." His words were like a blade cutting through her carefully constructed facade. Living for yourself. Who had she been? A passionate, is the artist, a free spirit, or just a shadow in Nathan's world? Before she could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Annie froze as Nathan stepped into the room, his face an unreadable mask, his eyes sharp with suspicion. He stood there, taking in the scene, the closeness between them, the tension in the air. Before his gaze settled on her, "Annie," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "what's going on here?" Time seemed to stop. Annie felt her heart seize in her chest. Elias remained still, refusing to look away from Nathan's piercing glare, but in that moment Annie knew that the fragile equilibrium she had been clinging to had shattered. There was no more hiding, no more running. "Nathan," she began, her voice trembling but firm with resolve, "we need to talk." But before she could say another word, Nathan raised a hand to silence her. "There's nothing to talk about," he said coldly, his tone cutting like frost. "I've seen enough." His words hung heavy in the room, final and unyielding. Without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway before fading into the shadows. Annie didn't follow him. She didn't call out to stop him. She simply stood there, her vision blurring as tears welled up in her eyes. Elias stepped closer, but this time she held up a hand to stop him. "No, Elias," she said, her voice breaking. "I need to be alone." He stared at her for a long moment. His expression was filled with quiet anguish. Finally, he nodded, his eyes heavy with unspoken pain. "All right," he said softly, "but you know where to find me if you need." Elias left the room, his footsteps fading into silence. Annie stood frozen in the center of the room, surrounded by the cold emptiness of the house. Slowly, she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. In that moment, she realized that whichever path she chose, there was no going back. She had crossed a threshold, And nothing would ever be the same again the next morning. Annie awoke to a house bathed in stillness. Nathan was gone, Elias was gone, it was just her and the pale sunlight streaming through the windows. She sat down at her work table, picking up a brush for the first time in years. This time she wasn't painting to please anyone, she wasn't painting to escape, she was painting for herself on the canvas. She painted a bird breaking free from an open cage, its wings stretching toward an uncertain but boundless sky. The painting was unfinished. But Annie didn't feel anxious for the first time. She understood that some stories didn't need a tidy ending to hold meaning, and her life was one of them.